Right. Perhaps I should start off by talking why there's this subtitle, A Missed Opportunity. When I was a history student in Trinity College about 50 years ago, the history books told me that after the Norman invasion and conquest of Ireland in the 12th century, there was a recovery of power by the Gaelic chiefs in the late Middle Ages. But they said nothing about what the chiefs had done with this recovery of power. So I started to try and find out. I'm still working on it. In 2020, I delivered an interim report with the book on Gaelic Ulster in the Middle Ages. Henry, son of Eoghan O'Neill, the great O'Neill of Tyrone, lived through most of the 15th century and left a lot of written records, an unusual amount of actual legal documents from his reign. But there's very little about him in the history books, even though he seemed towards the end of his life to be on a fair way to solving the Northern Irish problem through negotiation and compromise, and it was due to external circumstances and not his fault that he failed. In other words, if Richard III had won the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, Eoghan Rua O'Neill might have died in his bed instead of getting wounded in the battle and carried off to Clough. But first I want to take you on a whistle-stop tour of the origins of the O'Neill dynasty and the background of the Gaelic revival in Ulster. The term Eoghan was used in the early Middle Ages to describe a group of related royal dynasties ruling a series of kingdoms in West Ulster. There we are. And the Midlands of Ireland from about the 5th century into the High Middle Ages. They styled whichever of their number emerged as the most powerful king among this group in each generation as the king or high king of Tara. Yes, no, yes. Although archaeology would indicate that the hill of Tara was purely symbolic by this date, it wasn't actually occupied. And sometimes they used the title, instead of King of Tara, they called themselves King of Ireland, although in reality this meant no more than the most powerful king in Ireland. So, you can see the two main groups are the ones in the south, Clan Colmond, the kings of Meath, and the ones in the north, the Kinnologan kings of Tyrone and central Ulster. And they alternate as high kings down through the ages. The Ulster surnames we are familiar with today developed gradually between the 10th and the 12th centuries. And at this point, it must be made quite clear that whereas the whole federation of Eoghan dynasties, north and south, in Meath and Ulster, took their dynastic appellation from their 4th or 5th century forefather, Niall of the Nine Hostages. The medieval O'Neills traced themselves to a more modern ancestor, Niall Glundove, or Black Knee, king of Kinnologan and High King of Tara, who died in 919. His grandson, the High King Donal of Armagh, who died in 980, was the first to call himself Donal Uannail, or Donal, grandson of Niall. The practical extent of the northern kingdoms at the time of the Norman invasion in 1169 is approximately reflected in the boundaries of dioceses originally set up by the Synod of Kells in 52. In the immediate aftermath of the Synod of Kells, the County Louth area was to be claimed as part of the Diocese of Clogher by Donegal Carroll, King of Oriela, who had conquered recently conquered Louth. But the traditional boundary of Armagh's ecclesiastical jurisdiction, which went right down to the River Boyne, or the Armagh diocese, was restored by the Pope in the early 13th century, but by then County Louth was already colonised by the English, so you got a division of Armagh among the English and Armagh among the Irish. On this map, the red boundary lines show the modern diocese, and the green lines the modern counties. The red boundary of the Diocese of Raphoe marks the historic boundaries of Tyrconnell, but the green county boundary shows the extra land taken over from Tyrone by medieval O'Donnells. These encroachments on the Donegal side from Castlefin to Strabane and the peninsula of Inishowen were to be a cause of war between O'Neill and O'Donnell for the rest of the Middle Ages. In the 13th and early 14th century, the peninsula of Inishowen was also claimed by the de Burgh Earls of Ulster, who had already colonised the coast of Antrim and Down and were demanding annual tribute and military service from the western chiefs. That's what all those purple diagonal lines are. The O'Neills, the O'Kanes, the Maguires and the McMahons were all subject to the Earls of Ulster at this time. And even the O'Donnells, at the height of the power of Richard de Burgh, the Red Earl of Ulster, who died in 1326. It was only after the assassination of Earl Richard's grandson, the young Earl William de Burgh, known as the Brown Earl, which took place in 1333 and was followed by a joint rebellion of his Gaelic Irish and Anglo-Irish vassals, that the peninsula of Inishowen was fully annexed by O'Donnell and his chief vassal O'Doherty. This murder of the Brown Earl has long been identified as a key turning point in Gaelic Irish recovery of much land and power during the later Middle Ages. The Brown Earl's lands in Ulster and Connaught were inherited by a baby daughter living in England, leaving a power vacuum, and the O'Neills in particular benefited from this fact. Eoghan O'Neill, the Fat, who died in 1364, his son Neil Moore, Neil the Elder, and his grandson Neil Og, Neil the Younger, brought the earldom of Ulster to the brink of extinction by their raids. They took the title Kings of Ulster rather than Kings of Tyrone, along with the Red Hand of Ulster crest. That is an imprint of the actual seal of Eoghan or the Fat. Sigilla Modonus O'Neill Regis Ibernicor Baltonier, the seal of Hugh O'Neill, King of the Irish of Ulster. So it would have been in the 1360s. And they also took over from the de Burgh Earls the Bonacht of Ulster, so-called, the practice of billeting a certain quota of mercenary soldiers on each of the other Ulster chiefs, apart from O'Donnell, using MacDonald Gallo classes, where earlier the Earl's mercenaries had been commanded by the Welsh Macquillans, who ended up in North Ulster on Macquillan's route. And they repeatedly raided the Anglo-Irish colony east of the Bann, where the chief resistance they encountered came from a rival branch of their own family, the Clan de Boy O'Neills. The Clan Eoghan, or descendants of Eoghan, yellow-haired, had ruled Tyrone during the 13th century with the backing of the Earl of Ulster. The Earls of Ulster naturally preferred this branch of the family to Brian O'Neill of the Battle of Down, Brian Cumdoon, who had rebelled and claimed the title King of the Kings of Ireland, and Brian's son Donal, who had invited in Edward Bruce, the brother of the Scottish king, with a large army of Scots in 1315, and they ravaged the earldom till 1318, when Edward Bruce was finally killed. But the last Clandeboy king of Tyrone, Henry O'Neill, an earlier Henry O'Neill, who died in 1347, had conspired. He was such good friends with the Anglo-Irish of Ulster that when they rose to assassinate their own earl, he rose with them and was involved, therefore, in rebellion and murder of the earl. And there were 5 years' war from 1333 to 1338 before there was a peace negotiation. And by those peace terms, the English government in 1338 allowed the Clandeboy O'Neills to settle east of the River Bann on some of the lands that they had already laid waste in South County Antrim. Then in 1344, the Justiciar of Ireland, Sir Ralph Dufford. Sir Ralph Dufford had married the widow of the Brown Earl, and he was apparently a doting husband. He left a battle in the middle of the fight to go riding back to Dublin because she was having a baby and he wanted to be there, which is very unusual for a medieval husband, I would have thought. So he adored the Brown Earl's widow. He wanted her to have her dowry. He hated Henry O'Neill for taking part in the assassination, and he therefore deposed him and gave the title King of Ulster to the Fat, Eoghan O'Neill, who came from a long line of rebels, but hadn't been involved in the assassination. So when the O'Neills of Clandeboy finally submitted to Neil More O'Neill in the 1370s, the Anglo-Irish settlements in Antrim and Down were left wide open to attack from Tyrone. The map shows the extent of Neil More's lordship during King Richard's expedition to Ireland in 1394-5, at which time the English begin to call O'Neill of Tyrone the Great O'Neill, to distinguish him from the O'Neills of Clandeboy. When he died in 1403, the annals call Neil Og O'Neill High King of Ulster, and a man who the learned companies and pilgrims of Ireland thought would take the kingship of Ireland on account of the prowess of his hands and the nobility of his blood, and the excellence of his hospitality likewise. This reference to his hospitality probably arises from a great feast that Neil Og held in 1387 for all the poets of Ireland in a temporary feasting hall that he had erected on the hill of Avonmacha, or Navan Ring, near Armagh, the site of the legendary palace of Conor MacNessa, who is said to have ruled all Ulster at the time of Christ. So the O'Neills are both very conscious of the past and attempting to revive a provincial kingdom of Ulster. The whole of Ulster under O'Neill was the idea. All through the 14th century, the O'Donnells, who would have been their chief rivals, were weakened by a long succession struggle. The younger son of Neil More O'Neill, Henry Avery, or Harry Avery O'Neill, carved out a lordship for himself, stretching from the Thin Valley to Omagh, which he ruled from his castle, Harry Avery's castle in Newton Stewart. And to avoid confusion with the later Henry O'Neill that I'll be talking about, I propose to use the traditional term Harry Avery for this man. To be actually perfectly honest, Harry Avery was the name of a celebrated 18th century pirate, and somehow the people of Newton Stewart mixed Henry Avery and Harry Avery together. The real Harry Avery never went near Newton Stewart. So this is a genuine castle of the 14th century Henry Avery. It has been excavated by the Jobs, and they said that its construction and so on was quite consistent with the late 14th century castle. The O'Donnell Civil War ended in 1380. It's extraordinary, all these people along here, I haven't written it in this particular family tree, but they were just about every one of the ones in heavy type on this level were killed by their relations. So it would have so Connor was killed by Neil, Angus was killed by, I think, Neil again, Magnus and Youngloch killed everybody else, and then he reigned for 1 year and so on. Absolutely terrible civil war. But it ended in 1380 with the victory of Tarlach of the Wine O'Donnell, Tarlach and Eoghan, who reigned for the next 42 years and built up a gallows army by permanently contracting the service of the Scottish McSweeneys, installing them as lords of the Fannin Peninsula and Donegal. Tarlach's son Neilgar of II O'Donnell succeeded the kingship in 1422 at a time when the O'Neills, in turn, were in disarray because Neilog's eldest son Brian died of the smallpox 3 months after he was supposed to succeed to Neilog's throne. This is Brian Oak here. And a struggle for kingship ensued between his cousin Donal Bug, son of Harry Avery, and Neilog's younger son Eoghan O'Neill, who was allied to Maguire of Fermanagh, Bugman of Monaghan, and Neilgar of O'Donnell. That meant that Neilgar of II O'Donnell was the most powerful ruler inside this alliance, and he used it to keep Tyrone divided between two O'Neill claimants and bring all the Ulster chiefs into what apparently was a sworn confederation. They all took an oath, not only to obey Neilgar, but to get rid of the Earldom of Ulster completely out of the province. We only know this because Eoghan was made to sign or seal a submission in which he promised to go back on this oath and break the confederation. So he succeeded in bringing all the Ulster chiefs, this is Neilgar, succeeded in bringing all the Ulster chiefs on repeated invasions of the English Pale and taking black rent from the town of Dundalk. He partly took this black rent in barrels of wine because that was the sort of thing you could get in Dundalk. At a local level, Neilgar seized the territory between Omagh and the Finn Valley, which had been ruled by Harry Avery, and gave it to his brother, Natin O'Donnell, the Taoiseach, who built a castle on the river Finn, presumably at the modern Castle Finn, while Neilgar himself built a castle at Ballyshannon to control the passes into Connaught. But in this way, O'Donnell had annoyed both O'Neill claimants and the Anglo-Irish government. So in 1425, Eoghan O'Neill drew up an agreement with the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, James Butler, White Earl of Ormond, in which Butler recognised Eoghan's title to rule Tyrone, and Eoghan promised to break his alliance with Neilgar of O'Donnell. Eoghan then patched up his differences with his cousin Donal Bug, and together they recovered Harry Avery's former lordship from Omagh as far as Lifford, if not as far as Castle Finn. Eoghan's title as chief became official when his cousin Donal Bug was assassinated by the O'Kanes in 1432, and Eoghan was formally inaugurated as king of the province of Ulster on the flagstone of the kings at Tullahogue, that's near Cookstown. In 1434, Niall Gurrah was taken prisoner by the English, eventually dying on the Isle of Man in 1439. Eoghan attempted to take advantage of the situation by finally conquering Tyrconnell, but he was blocked by Niall's brother Neachtan, the Taoiseach, allied to the remaining sons of Harry Avery O'Neill, who were understandably furious at the assassination of their leader, Donal Bug. And this is the point where we finally meet up with Eoghan O'Neill's eldest son and heir, Prince Henry. Prince Henry was born about 1400, the son of Eoghan and of Katharina, daughter of Ardal MacMahon, king of the Monaghan area. Henry went on to live until 1489 to see great changes in economics and politics during the 15th century. It seems he came from a very close-knit family. He and his second brother, A of the Fuse O'Neill, who became his Taoiseach, never had a falling out of any kind. And as very young men, they cooperated with their mother to ransom their father in 1422, when he'd been captured by O'Neill of Clandeboy. The two brothers distinguished themselves militarily during the invasion of the Pale in 1434, the last big invasion under Niall Gurrah II, by covering the rear of the retreating army after a raid on Nobber, County Meath, and bringing their men off safely. In 1435, Henry and A of the Fuse rallied their men during a war against Neachtan O'Donnell and the sons of Harry Avery O'Neill, recovering their abandoned campsite and capturing McSweeney Fanad, constable of the Gallant Lasses of O'Donnell. Later that same year, Henry and his brother A became famous for a less honourable reason. They summoned the leader of the Harry Avery clan, Brian O'Neill, to come in for a parley under the safe conduct of the court poet, Eoghan Rua Mackenmeath. And when Brian O turned up, they cut off one arm and one leg from him, Brian O himself, and from his two sons. The outraged poet satirised Henry and A, and he wrote an elegy for Brian O's arm and leg, which were buried in the churchyard of Derry. Brian O was still alive, but the poem says, "Oh, hand that never shunned conflict, oh, foot that was swift over hill and dale," and so on. It's a full, what do you call it, a full official elegy, as it were, for the hand and foot. But Henry simply banished the poet and confiscated his lands, showing thus a rather modern disregard for a bardic poet's curse. Henry's career has other modern features in it. Although his early exploits make it clear that he was personally brave and an efficient military commander, he came increasingly to rely on diplomacy to gain his ends. In 1442, he journeyed down to the English Pale and persuaded the Lord Lieutenant of the day, once again James Butler, White Earl of Ormond, to give him a force of Anglo-Irish troops to assist his father Eoghan to conquer Neachtan O'Donnell. This may have been the occasion on which Henry married the White Earl of Ormond's niece, Gormley, the daughter of MacMurrough Cavan. The Anglo-Irish military assistance achieved all that he could have wished. Together with the army of Tyrone under his father Eoghan, the great O'Neill, they besieged Neachtan O'Donnell's castle on the River Finn. Neachtan surrendered the castle. His claims to the Harry Avery lordship from the Finn to Omagh, and promised to pay an annual tribute from the peninsula of Inishowen in recognition of the O'Neill's prior right to the territory, in return for O'Neill acknowledging the de facto lordship of O'Doherty there in Inishowen. Before leaving, Henry O'Neill garrisoned the castle on the River Finn with his own men. The terms of this treaty were to be broken repeatedly in the coming years, but it was formally renewed in 1452, 1462, 1488 and 1514. and it appears that these successive treaties between O'Neill and O'Donnell in the course of the 15th century were drawn up as formal charters, which Manus O'Donnell later showed to the Justicia Sir Anthony St. Leger in 1542 as proof that Inishowen was now legally part of Donegal. Sir Anthony remarked that these were the only legal charters produced in his court by O'Neill and O'Donnell, so they form another indication of Henry O'Neill's modernity and his search for an agreed solution that didn't rest on violence alone. In 1448, Archbishop John May appealed for the secular nobles of East Ulster to assist him in a dispute with the Bishop of Down. And interestingly, we're told that his letter was read aloud in the town of Ardglass, County Down, in the presence of Henry, eldest son of O'Neill, Jenkin McQuillan, captain of his nation, Robert Savage and Patrick White. These were the leading Anglo-Irish colonists. So O'Neill's son was evidently present peacefully inside the remaining colony of the Earldom of Ulster and was on friendly terms with the leading Anglo-Irish nobles there. The Annals record of later events suggests that Henry had been called in by the Anglo-Irish as the lesser of two evils to resist the expansion of the Clan de Boy O'Neills, who were taking over more and more land in North Down from their base in South Antrim, and were shortly to establish a castle at Belfast. The degree of trust in Henry's good faith shown by the Archbishops of Armagh and the Anglo-Irish nobility probably had a lot to do with his marriage to the White Earl of Ormond's niece. But in early 1449, the Earl and Henry found themselves on opposing sides. Eoghan O'Reilly, chief of East Breifne or Cavan, had just died, and the two rival O'Reillys claimed the succession. The great O'Neill had previously appointed the late Eoghan O'Reilly as chief, bringing the Cavan area into the Ulster province for the first time. Before that, as East Breifne, it was considered part of Connaught. O'Neill wanted Owen's son, Sean O'Reilly, to continue as a vassal of Tyrone. But the English of Meath, backed by Ormond, tried to impose Fergal O'Reilly, who had closer geographical and social links with Meath. For the last time, then, Eoghan O'Neill led MacMahon of Monaghan, McGuinness of South Down, O'Hanlon of South Armagh, on an invasion of County Louth to enforce his demands. The White Earl of Ormond quickly arranged a truce in April before the arrival in Ireland of Richard, Duke of York. Richard, Duke of York, was also Earl of Ulster through his mother, and he was appointed Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. And so the map shows the state of affairs during the Duke's visit in 1449. Immediately, the Gaelic Irish chiefs of Ulster were called upon to acknowledge the Duke's authority as Earl of Ulster, and they all turned up, including both O'Reilly claimants, that is Sean and Fergal, and Ormond's MacMahon candidate for the chieftainship of Monaghan, as well as O'Neill's appointee, Eoghan Rua MacMahon. Ormond was backing Brian MacPhelan MacMahon, and O'Neill was backing Eoghan Rua MacMahon. It's noticeable that the disappointed candidates for kingship in Cavan and Monaghan brought great gifts of cattle to the Duke, presumably to buy his support. But in the event, it was O'Neill's nominees who remained in power in these areas, and thus O'Neill continued as overlord of Cavan and Monaghan, South Armagh, as you can see, and right in past the Donegal border, where O'Gormley was under the land conquered by Harry Avery. Henry O'Neill then drew up an indenture with the Duke of York on the 27th of August 1449. It's one of the many documents that have survived from this era. And this stated that he had full powers to speak for his father, for his kindred and his followers, and in effect for most of Ulster west of the River Bann. He offered a relief payment of 600 beef cattle to have his family's title to their lands recognised by the Duke, and the Duke agreed to reduce the amount to 300 cattle in consideration of Henry's future military service. There was no mention of fines for rebellion, such as had featured in prior negotiations with the Mortimer Earls of Ulster. There was no dispute over whether the other Irish of Ulster should be directly subject to O'Neill or directly under the Earl, and the Earl's historic claim to impose quotas of mercenary soldiers on the other chiefs of Ulster, known as the Bonnet of Ulster, was now to be rendered as a simple money tax, leaving O'Neill in charge of the MacDonald gallow classes. The most contentious clause, the one that Henry was to break almost immediately, didn't directly affect the Duke at all, but concerned the feus of Armagh, where Henry's brother, A of the Feus, was building up a lordship by occupying the church lands of the Archbishops of Armagh and estates belonging to the Louth family, the Bellews of Castle Roach, though they were probably not in a position to actively cultivate those lands. The Duke of York soon went home to prosecute his ambitions, leading to the Wars of the Roses in England. But the text of Henry's agreement with him draws attention to further problems that Henry eventually solved by negotiation rather than violence. One was the fact that, as the Duke accepted, Henry was to all intents and purposes the current ruler of Tyrone, with claims to oversee the O'Donnells and many of the inhabitants of East and Ulster. But his father was still nominally the great O'Neill. The other was that the activities of his brother, A of the Feus, in occupying church lands in South Armagh was drawing down excommunications from the Archbishop of Armagh, excommunications that included Henry himself for failing to take steps against his brother. Excommunicated rulers could not claim loyalty from their subjects. They couldn't even eat at the same table with good Christians, officially. The whole O'Neill family had been under excommunication when the Duke came over in 1449, and Henry had first to make his peace with the Archbishop before he could even meet the Duke to negotiate with him. Trouble with the Archbishop broke out again in 1451 and continued to 1455, with the whole diocese of Armagh among the Irish being put under interdict. No priest allowed to say Mass or hear confession, and the principal O'Neills being proclaimed as heretics because of their depraved indifference to the Church's authority. Attacking heretics earned a crusader's indulgence of 40 days' spiritual reward, though the only people likely to take up the suggestion would have been the Bellews of County Louth and other Anglo-Irish. In 1455, Henry solved both these challenges. He persuaded his father to retire and then had himself inaugurated at Tullahoge in early July, in a ceremony attended, as we are told, not only by all the O'Neills, a phrase that might include O'Neill of Clantaboy, but also O'Kane from Derry, MacMahon from Monaghan, Maguire from Fermanagh, justifying his taking the title King of the Province of Ulster. And the Ulster Annals say that John May, Archbishop of Armagh, or Coab of Patrick, was also present. Other annals accuse Henry of deposing his father forcibly, and this may be why on the 4th of August, Henry brought Eoghan to Armagh, where he formally announced his retirement on the grounds of ill health in the presence of Archbishop May, and indeed he died of natural causes the following year. After this inauguration, the Archbishop addressed letters to Henry as Your Excellency, Prince of the Irish of Ulster. A few months later, a major concordat was drawn up between O'Neill and the Archbishop, arbitrated by lawyers representing each side. And again, we have the written record. It was agreed the cadet branches of the O'Neills who were occupying church lands would now have to pay rent for them. Not a very big rent. And Henry O'Neill's soldiers and administrators would enforce the collection of the rents and guarantee the Archbishop and his servants safe conduct whenever they came north on episcopal visitations. 150 years later, the Concordat was still remembered in a passage from the text Ceartí Néil, the right of O'Neill. In Father Eamon Devlin's translation, it reads, Henry, son of Owen, son of Neil Oak, son of Neil Moore, was a very mature and a very righteous king who suppressed falsehood and lawlessness and maintained the rights of the strong and the weak. And during that Henry's reign, the churches and the cemeteries were freed from every disability they had endured up to then. In 1463, Henry was at the height of his power and influence. You can see because he's got the Clan de Boy O'Neills under his thumb as well, of course. In that year, he authorised the Archbishop to grant safe conducts in his name to merchants wishing to trade in the ports of the Earldom of Ulster, apparently implying that Ardglass and Carrickfergus were within his sphere of influence. In that same year, the new King of England, Edward IV, who was the son of the late Duke of York and thus was absentee Earl of Ulster, sent Henry O'Neill a gold chain and 48 yards of scarlet cloth, in effect the livery of a peer of the realm. We actually have a letter from Richard III remembering this, saying that my brother wrote to O'Neill and sent unto him his livery. So it was actually intended as a formal acceptance of O'Neill as a vassal and peer. In 1467, Exchequer accounts record payments made to a messenger sent to Edward IV from the great O'Neill, who is here described as the king's friend. After his inauguration in 1455, Henry O'Neill had ceased his invasions of the English Pale, accepting instead payments of black rent from the inhabitants of Louth and Dundalk, while the Anglo-Irish of County Down made their payments either to the Great O'Neill or to O'Neill of Clan de Boy, whichever was the more immediate power at the time. So then, what went wrong with this new approach of compromised diplomacy and the acceptance of money payments to resolve age-old territorial disputes? One problem arose from a virtue of Henry, his close relations with his own brothers. He divided Tyrone out into delegated jurisdictions, with A of the Fews ruling South Armagh, Fews of Armagh, another brother, Art of the Castle of Omagh, ruling the former lordship of Harry Avery in the west, another brother, Phelim, in the Cookstown area, and another brother, Sean Bui, Sean the Yellow-Haired, in the castle of Kennard at Caledon on the Blackwater River. All of them except Sean Bui justified his trust by their loyalty and cooperation. But Henry lived for a very long time, and at the end of his reign, Tyrone was torn apart by the conflicting claims of his many nephews, trying to turn their father's administrative offices into hereditary lordships, with Henry making increasing use of Anglo-Irish troops to maintain himself in control. At the height of his power in the 1460s, Tyrconnell had again been paralysed by yet another bout of succession disputes. In 1452, Neachtan O'Donnell had banished the sons of Neil Gareth II, and Henry O'Neill, as their overlord, took up their cause and invaded Tyrconnell. Neachtan O'Donnell was killed, and Henry divided the country between the sons of Neil Gareth and the sons of Neachtan, reimposed the Treaty of 1442, giving the Finn Valley to himself, and even married the widow of King Neachtan, who was a Mayo Burke, and thus blocked the sons of Neachtan from any access to military support from Mayo. In order to do this, however, he had first to divorce Gormley Cavan, the niece of the White Earl of Ormond. And immediately the White Earl gathered a great army and brought it northwards and forced Henry to divorce Neachtan's widow and take back his wife Gormley. But it was the last great effort of the Earl. He died of old age and overexertion on his way home. Gormley herself died not many years after, and in 1464, Henry ended the succession struggle in Tyrconnell by appointing Eoghan Rua, son of Neil Gareth II, that is, Red Hugh the Elder, as king there. Eoghan Rua O'Donnell had a very long and successful reign up to 1505, and Henry himself married Eoghan Rua's very young daughter, Sheila, A bardic poem celebrating the marriage hints at the age discrepancy by predicting that the young bride will remain chaste despite the admiration of all her husband's courtiers. Henry's decision to divorce Gormley in 1452 may indicate that he already saw power in the Anglo-Irish colony was shifting from the Butlers of Ormond to the Fitzgeralds of Kildare. One of his last active policy strokes in 1480 was to arrange the marriage of his son Conmore O'Neill to the sister of the Justiciar of Ireland, Garrett More Fitzgerald, 8th Earl of Kildare. In terms of the English Wars of the Roses, the Kildares were Yorkists, where the Butlers had been Lancastrians. And we have seen that Henry had accepted livery from the Yorkist king Edward IV in 1463. But at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, the Lancastrian Tudors finally defeated the Yorkists and killed Richard III. And the fortunes of Henry O'Neill and his son Conmore became deeply affected. Henry had retired in 1483, passing the title of Great O'Neill on to his son Conmore. But as the Lancastrian butlers gained influence in the Anglo-Irish government through the activities of Black James of Ormond, a sworn opponent of the Earl of Kildare, who was Treasurer of Ireland in the year 1493. In that year of 1493, the only O'Neill who had butler blood, Henry Eoghan, son of Gormley, Cavan, assassinated his brother, Conmore, seized the kingship of Tyrone, and precipitated a fierce succession struggle in which the great Earl of Kildare became involved. One can only be thankful that Henry, son of Eoghan, did not live to see the dire result of some of his earlier policies, as he had died of old age in 1489, on the 15th of June, after spending his time happily, prosperously, luckily, and profitably, say the annals. Eoghan Rua I O'Donnell had also been allied with the Kildare Geraldines, fostering a young son of the great Earl of Kildare. But when the Lancastrian Tudors ascended the English throne, Eoghan Rua and his son Eadulf O'Donnell trimmed their sails and began to connect with the Tudors and the Butler family. On the other hand, the next generation of O'Neills after Eoghan and Clonbacach O'Neill were actually half Geraldine by blood, and they became inextricably involved in the fall of the House of Kildare and the Geraldine League, and alienated from the new English regime. So Henry O'Neill's long career of compromise and diplomacy had no lasting success. But it did provide a model demonstrating for future generations that actually greater power can be achieved by compromise than by war.